Hi, everyone. So we're honored today to be joined by Mark Morris, who is an expert on automatic exchange of information, such as the CRS and much else. So, Mark, thanks a lot for joining us. So, could you tell us a little bit about your background in terms of some of the companies and organizations you've consulted with and your general experience?
Yeah, so in the year 2000, when they were bringing out the EU Savings Tax Directive, which is automatic exchange of information on interest earned by anybody living in the EU and some other countries joined, like Switzerland. Uh, so I started consulting for the EU Commission, and it's quite easy to Google me, Mark Morris, economist, EU Commission, and you'll see me uh, consulting. And you can see on my website a referral letter, a glowing letter from the EU Commission on my help to them. And I became such an expert that the Tax Justice Network started using me to write their papers. And then the Green Party in Germany called me to testify at the Bundestag about a tax agreement with Switzerland. I told them why it wouldn't work and that they should reject the tax agreement. Uh, and then I started consulting for the OECD. Pascal Saint-Amans was head of the automatic exchange. And then I did a lot of consulting for this residency by investment to avoid automatic exchange, and therefore they brought out a special paper on that. And there's quite a few articles on me in The Economist. You can go Google them. Of course, you got to subscribe to read the articles. So people ask, why did you consult for the other side if I'm uh, advising on solutions that avoid all the automatic exchange? So it was to see what they could do and what they couldn't do. So obviously I'm on the inside, so that if I give a structure, it's permanent, okay, why they can't do it. But I'll explain later why I use the jurisdictions I do. Okay, so um, that's about me. Okay, so it's been, what's it, 25, 26 years of exclusively automatic exchange of information. I don't do anything else but exchange of information.
That's a really interesting point because a lot of people in tax, they have like different specialties, right? Maybe two or three, but you are just specialized in automatic exchange of information. But there are, of course, different forms of automatic exchange of information. So you've got the CRS, you've got FATCA, you've also got, I think it's pronounced CARF, right?
So the exchange, notice I don't say automatic exchange because there's also exchange on request. So the we'll go over the origins of FATCA just on your next question. And that the EU Commission had the EU Savings Tax Directive, but they got rid of that when they adopted a version of the of FATCA called Common Reporting Standard. Uh, and then all the countries, 180 countries, signed the OECD Multilateral Competent Authority Agreement, which is three types of exchange of information. It's the automatic exchange of information, it's the exchange on demand, and it's the spontaneous exchange. So if a bank or a financial institution suspects something is fishy, they're supposed to spontaneously exchange that information, either with their government, if it's if it's a IGA1, or directly with the authorities, the other authorities. So so FATCA is the one for US persons, and that started in 2010. The rumblings of that started in 2008 and 9 when UBS and Credit Suisse, there was a whistleblower that he got incarcerated as well, but he got 100 million whistleblower reward. But he told the Americans how the Swiss banks were helping to hide money, how they would help the U.S. persons get the money. You know those stories about putting diamonds into toothpaste and visiting America, etc. So in 2010, there was a piece of legislation called the Higher Incentive Act, which was to help grow employment, but it was going to cost a lot of money. So, and then they said at the same time, a subpart of that legislation would be FATCA, which is so that we can start collecting taxes on U.S. persons with accounts overseas, and that would help pay for this new legislation to increase employment. And that's why it was on both sides of Congress, the Republicans and the Democrats. But the Democrats wanted it to be stricter, like if we're going to exchange information, if we're going to get information, shouldn't we also give information? And the Republicans never wanted that because it would damage the banking, especially in Texas and Miami. So they never agreed to provide information equivalent to what they were receiving. The Democrats have tried since 2010 to pass legislation for the Americans to give the information, the equivalent, but the Republicans have always blocked it. And they've stopped trying since 2019, which is interesting. Maybe next time when the Democrats have all three parties, the House, the Congress, and the presidency, then maybe there'll be exchange of information coming from the states. But I wouldn't be holding my breath on that. So then the EU Commission and the OECD said this is much better than what we've got. So let's adopt it, adopt FATCA. But of course, FATCA is aimed at US persons irrespective of their tax residence, whereas CRS is based purely on your tax residence. If you are a resident in one of the 130 countries that have joined CRS, then there'll be exchange of information. But there's still no information exchange on the other 70 or 80 countries that haven't joined CRS, like Serbia, Montenegro, Philippines, etc. And then when they did all of this, crypto was not a financial asset, funny enough. Okay. So in 2020-21, they started saying, we've got to have exchange of information for crypto. And it's called CARF, Crypto Reporting Framework. So Crypto Asset Reporting Framework. Notice they call it crypto asset. So the Americans haven't adopted that. I think they've got some internal reporting for crypto, but definitely not international. An American with crypto in another country, there's no reporting. But try find a crypto exchange to open an account for an American outside of America. It's pretty difficult, okay? So we'll get to the loopholes because there's one major loophole, which they've never closed, and we'll talk about what the Senate has said about closing that loophole. But when they did CARF, OECD saw this loophole, and they closed the loophole. I'll explain that later on. That's why they didn't close it for CRS, they closed it for CARF, and therefore if you want a structure that avoids CARF, it must be a different structure to the one that avoids CRS.
That's very interesting. So the tax authorities knew that there was this loophole in the CRS, so they closed it for new agreements like the CARF.
Yeah.
So what would you say are the major loopholes that exist in some of these tax agreements like the CRS and CARF?
There were some exemptions, like some broad-based retirement plans and giving the money to the lawyer to keep for you and so on. The OECD used to bring out what is called still the OECD CRS frequently asked questions. And they brought that out 2017, 18, and 19 every year. And they would highlight the new sections in yellow, which was closing the loopholes. They went after loopholes in Singapore with trust. They went after loopholes in Hong Kong with pension plan, also as it's called, pension plans. But then they realized closing loopholes this way with new frequently asked questions was like trying to stamp out cockroaches in a kitchen. There's always going to be more. So then they brought out what is called the mandatory disclosure rule. So anybody promoting or anybody forming or designing a structure that avoids CRS or is opaque and therefore hides the beneficial owners or controlling persons, you're supposed to report that. Even if you hear about it, you're supposed to report that to the tax authorities, and then, okay, nothing's ever been closed on that. There's been hundreds of reports, but they've never done anything on that. But why that was a complete flop, the EU adopted it, and only 10 countries outside the EU, South Africa, etc., adopted it. The rest, like Switzerland and Liechtenstein, said, we've got too much on our plate. We're not going to adopt a whole new legislation. So, and so what is that? 90 countries, maybe even more, just didn't adopt it. And then another reason why that's a complete flop is it actually exempts any promoter or lawyer or supplier that is resident in a country that hasn't adopted mandatory disclosure rules, such as Switzerland. If I'm doing all these designings and promoting from Switzerland, there's no MDR, mandatory disclosure rules. And I think the biggest weakness that they had was lawyers throughout the world are excluded from this for confidentiality reasons, the privilege of confidentiality and so on. So lawyers can talk about structures, and they are not part of the mandatory disclosure rules. So that's a complete flop. But now, I told you about minor loopholes and so on. It can be more complicated, like one trust settling a second trust, and therefore the settler of the first trust is a trustee. Okay, I'm not getting into complex things, but the simplest and most well-known loophole of exchange of information, which is easy to check on AI. Okay, go to DeepSeek and say what is the major loopholes of FATCA or CRS or this one. It's called the shell bank loophole. So the Senate Finance Committee in the U.S. wrote a 40-page report on this particular loophole. Why? Because there was a billionaire, multi-billionaire in the U.S. His name was William Brockman. He was a private equity investor. He worked with Bernie Madoff. Okay. So he was the biggest single case in U.S. history on the individual avoiding tax. 2.7 billion tax he avoided. So using the shell bank loophole. The shell bank, funny enough, it doesn't mention it, but it describes it. So I'll describe it in language everybody understands. People set up an investment entity, which is a company that earns financial, more than 50% of its income is financial, passive income, and more than 50% of its assets have the potential to earn passive income. So even if you're holding cash with no interest, it's still got the ability or the potential to produce interest. Therefore, it's part of being an investment entity. And then if you appoint a professionally managed asset manager, doesn't have to be an FI, but professionally managed, then that entity is a financial institution. And any bank or financial institution that has an investment entity as its account holder, so the bank account holder is an investment entity. The weakness of FATCA and CRS is one financial institution doesn't report on another financial institution. So why did they have that weird weakness? It's because they didn't want duplicate reporting. They didn't want one financial institution reporting, looking through that. And so the weakness is this investment entity or shell bank gets a GIN, Global Intermediary Identification Number, ticks that it's a financial institution, an investment entity, and then the bank doesn't look at that at all, doesn't report, doesn't do anything. Now, the investment entity as a financial institution has obligations to report on its account holder, which is usually the person that set it up. But he just keeps his head down and illegally reports, files. There are no reportable persons. And the weakness is there's no or very little auditing of these investment entities. Um, so what the US in this 40-page report is that if an investment entity files that there are no reportable persons, then there should be an audit. So that would be part of FATCA. So maybe the authorities in the country that you set up, and most of these they say are set up in the BVI. They said like there's 160,000 investment entities there, but the population is like 30,000. Um, but investment entities can be in any country, okay? But they mostly go for, it's not BVI, it's Cayman Islands, funny enough. Um, so there was an anti-abuse shell bank legislation written by the Democrats in 2022 to say that if an investment entity files that there's no reportable persons, then there should be an audit saying, okay, if you're saying that there's no reportable person, who are the reportable persons? And if it's a US person, why did you not file? And then you get all the penalties. Okay, so I think that loophole has a limited life. When you talk about loopholes, that's I mean, there's 40-page report from the Senate. There's this new legislation that's been around for a few years, never been passed. But I know from clients that they say, I'll just do an investment entity and not report to myself. But that has a limited life. And if you get
Mm.
caught, the penalties are going to be horrendous. 50%, 100% of your assets and so on.
So, Mark, how about CARF then? How does that differ from what you just spoke
Okay.
about?
The CARF was written mostly by the OECD, not by the Americans, because they don't have CARF. They've got their own internal reporting for crypto. So CARF went after the shell bank loophole, and it's only in one sentence. It's even I had missed that. My lawyer pointed that out to me. There's one sentence in all of CARF, and CARF is about, what, 40, 50 pages, and there's one sentence. And basically it says, if you're an investment entity, financial institution, the crypto asset reporting institution, like the exchange, must look through investment entities, look through to the controlling persons, and report on anybody who owns more than 25%, etc. So what CARF has done is just ignore that investment entities are non-reportable financial institutions. They are still financial institutions, and they've still got their own reporting obligations. So there's duplicate reporting, one by the exchange, etc., and also obligation on the investment entity to report on itself, which is interesting because the whole reason that they left out one financial institution reporting on another, they didn't want duplicate reporting. And here, all of a sudden, they don't mind duplicate
Mhm.
reporting on CARF for investment entities. I mean, what other financial institution are people going to use? There are four types of financial institutions in automatic exchange. There's depository institutions, which is banks. So unless you set up your own bank, you're not going to be a financial institution. There's investment entities, which everybody uses. There's specified insurance companies that set up PPLIs and other types of annuities that are cash related, cash value related. And then the last one is the one that hardly anybody understands is the um, SPV custodial institution. SPV means it's a custodial institution for you and you only. It doesn't mean it's Pershing Bank or JP Morgan, although they are financial. But the one that people could use but don't understand is the SPV custodial institution, which is mentioned, funny enough, in the OECD frequently asked questions about can payment for fees to SPV custodial institutions be paid to third parties that do the administration? And they said yes. So you don't have to actually pay the custodian institution. You can pay a lawyer or accountant. Okay.
So, That's interesting. So these custodial institutions, SPV custodial institutions, you say they're quite different to a lot of the other structures and a lot of people don't understand them. So why might somebody want to use that structure, for example?
Okay, so now we're getting into the only solution that I think it works and will work forever, okay? So I told you the basis is that if you've got a chain of financial institutions, one owning the other, one owning, um, then nobody reports except for the top level financial institution. And I always ensure that the top level financial institution is a SPV custodian institution. That means it's your custodian institution. Now, normally you would have to report because this is interesting. For CRS, they said that if you're an investment entity located in a non-participating jurisdiction, let's just say it's Serbian company, or, there's still 80, 90 countries, then the underlying financial institution must treat that like a passive NFE and look through to the controlling persons. And if there are other financial institutions in the chain of ownership of that investment entity, they must carry on looking until they finally find the controlling person. Doesn't matter if those other financial institutions are non-reportable. So using a investment entity in a non-participating jurisdiction is an absolute killer. And a lot of people don't know that, okay? But there's no look-through of a custodian institution. Because normally a custodian institution is JP Morgan. What are they going to look through? Jamie Dimon or somebody who owns 5% or 15% of a custodian institution? There's no, but nobody, and I tell you now, nobody, so for me, uses SPV custodian institutions. That means you can look at what the SPV structure is. It's separate from everybody else. It's for the risk of you. But if in effect it's your custodian institution. So what is a custodian institution for CRS and FATCA? Because they copied each other, and it's in CARF, exact words. It's an entity, and entity in automatic exchange is a company, a trust, a partnership, a foundation. It's basically it's anything that's not skin and bones, or like somebody trading, okay, that holds assets for the account of somebody else, so not for its own account, and earns more than 20% of its income from custody fees. So the type of entity that I use is a trust. So the trust is a custodian institution. Why? Because if a trust owns a company, an investment entity in my case, then it's holding that company shares for the settler. So it's holding the shares of the underlying company for the settler. It's not holding the assets of the underlying company. So the structure is quite simple. It's two levels. It's the SPV trust, custodian institution trust, which holds an investment entity company. And the investment entity company holds stocks, ETFs. It can even hold some operating companies as long as the total financial assets and assets that produce passive income is more than 50%. So I often have banks who don't understand this, and somebody says, I've set up a consulting company, or, and I've got lots of cash, or I'm investing the money. Is that an investment entity? And they say yes. And it's not, because the income must be passive income, more than 50%. And passive income is dividends, capital gains. It's not consulting income. But so many banks say you've got cash, or they say, what are you holding the cash for? And they can say, well, I'm holding it to invest. Or it gets worse. They say, I'm holding the assets to buy widgets for a company, or to buy an operating company. Then the bank says, well, then you are active NFE, and that's non-reportable completely. So there's so much misunderstanding with CRS. It's ridiculous. Okay. So the structure that I have is simple. It's an SPV custodian institution, which is a trust, and it owns an investment entity. The bank doesn't report on the investment entity because it's a financial institution. The investment entity files once a year. We have no reportable persons. This wasn't like Bill Brockman filing,
Mm.
I have no reportable persons. He owned it. He should have reported on himself, but he just lied. And somebody who wanted to earn the 30% whistleblower fee blew on him, 2.8 billion. That's that's a big whistleblower reward, 30%. And he got he got found guilty and he was going to be incarcerated. He was 80 and he fell over on the golf course, and that was the end of that case. Yeah.
I heard of that case, but as you said, that case was the so-called US shell bank loophole, right?
Yes, correct.
But what you're talking about is quite different. Now, what's interesting is when people think about trusts and other structures, they often think about jurisdictions, right? They think about, well, is it good to go in, I don't know, Guernsey, Jersey, Singapore, or this jurisdiction, Cayman,
Cook
whatever.
Islands are popular.
Cook Islands. So, are you jurisdiction agnostic, or do you have like some favorite jurisdictions you like to use?
There's only one jurisdiction in the whole world that I see you using. Now, be careful when you use the word jurisdiction. You are talking of the governing law or the proper law. It doesn't mean that the trust is there. It just means it's the law. Just because. So the UK has three types of trusts category. They have the normal UK trust. So that's with UK trustees or UK settlers. That's 95% of trusts. Then they have non-UK trusts, which is a UK person using a Jersey trust or an Isle of Man trust. That's called
Mm.
non-UK trust. But the settler is still UK, but the trustee is not UK. Okay. But the third one is the one that's least understood, least used, least spoken about. Try and find information on this, but it's there. Under HMRC, it's easy to find information. It's called the UK Non-Resident Trust. What does that mean? Okay, so it's a UK governing law trust, but none of the trustees are UK resident. And before until February this year, none of the settlers should be UK resident. But they changed that in the UK. Up until February, they said if you deal with a UK relevant person, there are 15 types of relevant persons: notaries, high level gold traders, or property agents, etc. Um, then you must register on the TRS. But in February this year, they changed it all. It's quite simple to be non-resident. If you are not UK resident and none of the trustees are UK resident, then you are non-resident trust. I'll look into more what happens if you are UK resident and you're going to change, okay? Because then you can use a non-resident trust, okay? But uh, so what's the advantage? Why do I say the UK is the be all and end all of trust? UK non-resident trusts have a couple of unique features that are not available anywhere else in the world. So the trustee is resident somewhere else, um, which means they are not registered on the TRS, the Trust Register Service, which is the beneficial owner register. A lot of other countries like Guernsey or Isle of Man say, well, we don't register that in the central register, but it is registered with the trustee and the
Mm.
information is available. Here, this trust is not registered at all with TRS. That document that you sign and we get a apostille is private between you and the trustee. It's not registered anywhere. Um, and if the trust doesn't have income liability, and of course, outside of the US, it's difficult for a trust to own anything because it's just an arrangement. Whereas in the US, trust can actually own assets, but not in not outside the UK, US. So if the trust is not liable for any of the six types of UK taxes, income tax, capital gains tax, tax on shares, tax on property, etc. Then the trust is not registered with HMRC either. So it's not registered with HMRC, it's not registered with CRS, it's not registered anywhere. And so that is much more confidential than, say, Cook Islands, because Cook Islands has common reporting standard, and they must report your trust and all trustee details and benefit back to your country. And even though they've got their own laws about, well, try to get hold of the assets, it's difficult. You've got 2 years. You must claim here, etc. The fact that the information is still transparent. Okay. There were some big cases, especially Bernie Madoff and so on. People put their assets into Cook Island Trust. Now, a lot of Cook Island trusts are crazy popular because people don't understand. So the courts were finding tracing assets for people who put money into Cook Island Trust. The court said, okay, we can't get the assets, but if you don't bring back the assets within 6 months, we're going to sue you or put you in jail or take your other assets. So much for the Cook Islands. Okay, whereas I use a jurisdiction where it can't be found out. Okay, we'll talk about Norway. Yeah.
Sure. So you mentioned about these non-resident UK trusts, and they can have, or they should have, a trustee, which is by definition not a British trustee. So you use Norway typically, or a jurisdiction or a place in Norway, right? So tell us more about that structure and why you think that works.
Okay. Norway has 5 dependencies. 3 in the Antarctic and nobody lives there. 1 near Greenland where there's only like 80 people, 40 military and 40 weather people. Okay, it used to be Dutch, called Jan Mayen. And then the one that's critical to me is Svalbard. Svalbard means cold coast, okay? So Svalbard belonged to nobody up until the 1920s. And there was a lot of coal mining there because the best coal in the world, and they would sell the coal to German crops, etc. Because it used to be an island on the equator in the Atlantic and then floated up over millions of years. So in 1920, the different coal mines there were Russian, they were Norwegian, Finnish, Iceland, even the Dutch had coal mines there. And with no law, didn't belong to anybody. It was the Wild West. And they would be fighting over the land claims and so on. So they knew they had to come under the sovereignty of somebody, and everybody wanted it. Nice piece of land, and fishing and so on. But the only one they could all agree on was Norway, not because it's closest to Norway, it's still 800 kilometers away from Norway. In fact, it's closer to the North Pole than it is to Norway. Norway was the only country that had goodwill because it wasn't partaking in the First World War. And so they got 48 countries to sign the Treaty of Svalbard, 1925. Svalbard before this was known as Spitsbergen, and some double tax treaties like America still call it Spitsbergen, but it's Svalbard. Funny enough, the biggest island in Svalbard has many islands. It's double the size of Belgium. It's got, it's a big island, but people don't see it because when they were kids, and there was a globe in the classroom, the nut at the top of the globe would cover Svalbard. So they never saw it as a kid. But people have seen the seed vault that's there. The seeds of the world are kept there. And the Treaty of Svalbard has got 8 clauses. Not long. The whole treaty is maybe 5 or 6 pages. But so the Treaty of Svalbard gives autonomous areas like fishing, like coal mining, like environment. Immigration is important, and I explained that just now. But the one that's important for me is the tax. It's tax autonomous. So it's an integral part of Norway, but it's tax autonomous. And the treaty says that any of the signatories, there's 48 of them, that they must all be treated the same. There can't be any benefit given from one to the other. and that any tax that's collected must be only for Svalbard. So therefore, when Norway does a tax treaty, and Norway's got a lot of tax treaties, over 100, they always say in page 2, the definition of Norway is, continental, but excludes Svalbard. It also excludes the other dependencies, but that's irrelevant. So the U.S. tax treaty, it's between Spitzberg in the U.S., Canada as well, but every treaty in the world, just go randomly look at Mexico, Japan, anything that's got tax treaties. It will say the same wording, same paragraph. The definition of Norway excludes Svalbard. So whenever they do any type of tax treaty, including the OECD Multilateral Competent Authority Agreement, which is the one that's the legal basis for exchanging information, it's got the same paragraph. But Article 29 of the OECD Multilateral Competent Authority says any country can include or exclude a territory from this multilateral competent authority. And the only one in the whole world to utilize that article is Norway. Okay, so only Norway excludes some of its territory. So this is vital for everything. If a country doesn't have a tax treaty, it can never join something like CRS. It can, but more importantly, and I told you exchange and demand is more important than exchange, automatic exchange. No country can ask information to Norway about an entity in Svalbard. Who owns this? What's the tax situation? So our trust is there, so nobody can ask a question about the trust. But more importantly, the underlying company owned by the trust. We're going to why use British companies, but I suppose you could use some others. If you've got a British company as the underlying investment entity, UK law says in Company House, when you register the person of significant control, they use the word person of significant control in lieu of beneficial owner, okay? It's their own rules. It's not the FATF rules. So the own rules of Britain, of UK, of a company owned by a trust is the trustee. It's not the settler. It's not the beneficiary. It's not the protector. It's nobody, just the trustee. Unless the beneficiary can change things in the trust, which I've yet to see one like that, okay? So therefore, if there's any query on the tax situation or financial situation of the investment entity, like they said they would do audits in the future, they can't ask a question, who's behind this company besides the trustee? And they can't ask the trustee any question because the trustee is in Svalbard. So it's far better than using Cook Islands or Jersey or Nevis, because that information is going to come back. Here, they can't ask. There's a famous case, Jimenez, where some British guy ran to Dubai and was hiding assets using his Dubai company. And HMRC asked him questions about his tax situation. He said, I'm outside the UK, I'm not answering you. So there was a court case that went up all the way to the High Court, and it said that the HMRC can ask these questions that are outside, where the taxpayer is living outside the UK. And then they said, but if he doesn't answer, like he didn't answer, then you can use the tax treaty to force the exchange of information. And I think UK and Dubai, so the UK authorities would force him. And then it also said, if you're still unhappy with the result, you can penalize him using the assets in the UK. Well, I don't keep any assets. I don't use a UK bank. Okay, so the structure is, when you say Norway, it's Svalbard, but Svalbard's part of Norway, holding a UK company, because the person of significant control is the Svalbard trustee. So nobody can ask any questions on tax or finance to the owner of the person of significant control. And nobody can ask about the trust, because it's a trustee in Svalbard, and there's nobody even there to answer questions. They've got Department of Fisheries, Department of Dog Sledding. There's no tax, international tax department there. So the question is, will this change? So there's two questions here that you can ask. Will the UK ever change its law on non-resident trusts? And non-resident trusts have been around since the Crusaders, because it was the French. You know how the Crusaders work. Some Crusader would give his. It's a story. They don't know if it's true, but it sounds good. Crusader would give his farm to somebody, and they would be the trustee to the. And then when they came back, they said, "Can I have my farm back?" And the guy would say, "Get lost! It's my farm." So they came back with trust law. They'd say, "You're the legal owner, but not the beneficial owner." So I don't see the UK changing that law, non-resident trusts. And there's hardly anything written about it. Not going to change it because of me. And then the other question is Svalbard. So Svalbard has got 48 countries that signed the Treaty of Svalbard, which is the one where there's all the tax autonomy. But there's other things that are in that treaty, like if you are a national of one of the 48 countries, you can go and live and work in Svalbard without residence, without a visa. But anybody in the whole world can go visit Svalbard, without a visa. You just got to fly to Norway, and then you stamp out of the Schengen, and then when you get there, there's just a warehouse. Your luggage is sitting in the warehouse, and you go pick it up. There's nobody to greet you. No customs, no immigration, no nothing. Okay. So now on the due diligence documents that the banks ask, the address that we give for the trustee is as follows: They, which means road, 228 is building. The buildings there are numbered, and you can Google the building. They 228,9.9, that means apartment number 9 or office number 9, comma, Longyearbyen is there's two villages or cities on Longyearbyen, on Svalbard. The biggest one with a population of 2,000 is Longyear. Longyear was an American who arrived there on his private yacht in 1906. And they all ran down to him and said, "You should set up some coal mines here. The coal is big." And he did. And then when they signed the treaty, he sold those mines for a fortune to the Norwegian government. So the government owns the mines. And then there's a Russian town there, 400 Russians, 400 Ukrainians, but most of the Russians have left, because to get there, you could fly or take a boat from Murmansk. Now that's cut off. So they must fly via Norway, and quite difficult to do that. And that is called, I forgot the name, the Russian town, okay? But the Russian town is under the sovereignty of Norway, okay? So the address is Vey 228,9, comma, then the postal code is Norwegian because it's part of Norway, N9170, then comma, Norway. I don't say comma, I say comma, Longyearbyen, comma, Norway. I don't say Svalbard because it's part of Norway. And then the banks see a Norwegian trustee on the UK trust, and they see a underlying company. I'll tell you the truth though, 90% of my clients, or 80%, are Chinese, because I've got a very good Chinese broker, and none of them use a UK company. They use Hong Kong and everything else, okay? But I like the UK company because of they don't seem to be scared of exchange on demand. You know, they use Seychelles, they use Belize, they use Marshall Islands, they use Singapore, okay? But for me, if you truly want confidentiality, and we'll get to the PEPs you spoke about just now, then use a UK company. And simply declare your company as dormant. Or you can set up a PPLI underlying, and then that company has no assets or income. So there are two ways of three ways of getting your money out of the structure. One is you set up a PPLI, and the PPLI owner, the policy owner, is the company. And so the insurance is not going to report because the owner is an investment entity, an FI. And so you can loan up to 85% of your assets and you're loaning the money from the insurance company you're borrowing, not from your PPLI. So, and people, insurance companies loan money. That's a major activity of theirs. Now, you set up the interest rate. You say, I'll pay 7% because it's supposed to be uncollateralized. And then the insurance company will take 0.5% or 0.25%. And the rest is surreptitiously added back to your policy. So now if you're using the loan for business purposes, then the interest is tax deductible where you live. So you can deduct the tax, but it gets put back to your policy and you can borrow it. And so no country in the world, I've looked this up, every country, even the States, if you borrow money and you never pay it back, there's no, after 5 years that becomes taxable income. Somebody told me that in Switzerland, and I broke my back to pay back in 5 years. I didn't have to. The accountant didn't understand. It cost me a lot of money to pay back. There's no conversion of that loan into taxable income. No country in the world says, you haven't paid back, we're going to regard that as taxable income. However, if the party that you borrowed the money writes it off and says you don't have to pay us back, then that's taxable income or taxable capital gains or whatever. Okay. The other way, which is common, is the banks, most of them, will issue you credit cards. So I got a Swiss bank. He gave a guy from Korea. He gave them 3 credit cards, a debit card. No, he gave him in 3 currencies. Now I remember. One set was a debit card, one was a credit card, and then there were 3 currencies: sterling, dollar, and Swiss francs. You could have got a euro one as well. And those you can have 50,000 on those. So you work there, that's 8 times 50,000 per month. Okay. So that's a way of getting. Now, a third way of getting your money is there are companies, finance companies, if you give them collateral, they're not related to you, then they'll loan you the money. But there, the 7 or 8% they charge you is money lost forever. They'll keep it. And entities. And I was talking about your assets are held in investment entity, and CARF would look through investment entities. So you couldn't use the same company. You can use the same trust, but not the same company. The company you must use must be, listen carefully, must be a non-financial institution. So you can't have somebody managing the money. And it must be it must be passive entity. So the company that's holding your crypto must be a nominee. It must say, we are holding the assets for somebody else. Who's that somebody else? It's owned by the trust who's holding the assets for the settler. Therefore, you tell the bank, this entity, which is not a financial institution, is a nominee for the trust or for the settler. So CRS, FATCA, and CARF says if an entity is not a financial institution and is holding assets for somebody else, it's a nominee. And they use other words, straw man and signatory and agent. But if you're one of those and we're a nominee, then you're not regarded as the account holder. So this entity is not regarded as the account holder. Who's the account holder? The account holder is the party you're holding the assets for. And we're holding the assets for its owner, which is the SPV custodian institution. And therefore, when it's time to report, if the owner is deemed or regarded as the custodian institution, because it's an FI, that's not looked through. There's no reporting on FATCA. Sorry, on crypto.
Fantastic, Mark. And what about for politically exposed people then who just want confidentiality? What would you say in that case?
Okay, so for us, we don't care about PEPs. Okay, I mean, PEPs, they say, must have added due diligence. Your issue is the bank that would accept, and banks accept PEPs. People think they don't. Okay, they do enhanced due diligence. Is this money that he's got because he's in a PEP situation? Banks, you ask any bank, they'll tell you that they accept PEPs. But I can give you banks that are only too happy to take PEPs. I think they're based in Nevis. Their headquarters is in Luxembourg. So I can help, or you shouldn't be too scared, but I think it might take a bit long if you just go to a random bank and say, can this PEP? Now, the PEP doesn't, the only person who knows it's the PEP is the bank. The UK company has the trustee in Norway, in Svalbard. The trust has only the trustee. The PEP's not mentioned anywhere. So, and nobody can ask the trust or the underlying company questions about the company, about the PEP, about the source. It's down to the bank. And if the bank's happy to have a bank account in the name of the company, but knowing that it's the final beneficial owner is the PEP, it'll work. And it can, I mean, I'm working with some very well-known PEPs, okay, presidents of companies and sorry, presidents of countries and their brother, billionaires, but billionaires before they were even voted,
Hmm.
like Indonesia, etc.
Also, Mark, what changes do you see happening potentially in the next few years? So, for example, what about real estate? Do you think real estate is going to be included in some of these exchange on demand and ARA
Yeah.
agreements?
Yes. So the first change that I see happening is if you're using an investment entity, a shell bank, that is not owned by another financial institution, I believe within 5 years, maybe even less, there'll be audits that are required to say the bank will ask, you reported, it's easy. The bank can see, you reported, or the country, you reported no for FATCA, you reported no for CRS, you're an investment entity, a shell bank. What the hell's going on? Who's this magic person that you... It's so easy. It's so
Hmm.
stupid to use that loophole because you can't keep for FATCA and CRS report no reportable persons. Okay.
Hmm.
So, second of all, you can AI or Google this. India was really pushing the OECD to include real estate because I think the Indians, maybe even China as well, are sending money out. Um, and people in China send money out via the Belt and Road project, which never happens.
Hmm.
Again, then they buy property and it's not reported back. So it's really interesting that one of the effects of FATCA is that the Americans invested a lot of. So what money did they invest in? Property and gold and paintings, art. Okay, so property is coming for sure. You can Google it, and the OECD is talking about. I think they said as little as 2 years from now that
Hmm.
property will be included. I'm working with a real billionaire. He sold his AI. Lucky him, Spanish guy. I said to him, if you want the ultimate secrecy, confidentiality, then have our trust, our because it's a trust, our custodian institution, settle a new trust anywhere in the world with any trustee in the world. The settler of that new trust is the trustee. at least in UK, in non-US terms. It's not the trust, it's not the original, it's the trustee, because the trustee owns the assets. I'm giving you this company. And the new company, let's say in Malta or Cyprus or Singapore, the trustees would have reporting obligations, but they're not going to report on the settler because the settler is resident in Svalbard, and somebody in Svalbard is not reportable because they're not part of CRS. So talk about ultimate secrecy. Of course, if you're a PEP, try find another trustee that would take you, but could be.
That's a different matter.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, Mark, and where should people go if they're interested in using your services?
I think people find me just putting Mark Morris Trust, but the name of the website is Co-Ownership Trust, but co-ownership has got a dash, you know. So why co-ownership trust? Before I was doing this, I was doing co-ownership trust. Co-ownership is another unique UK type of trust where the trustees and the settlers are the same people, the same couple who own property. Okay, okay. It's useful to have that. Okay. And of course, there's no reporting there because they're resident in the trustee and the settler and the beneficiaries are all resident in the same jurisdiction.
Fantastic. Well, thanks. Have a great
Okay,
day, Mark.
bye.